Hi, in this video we'll be looking at transaction management in Nabu. Let's start by adding a database. And in that database, let's add a company table. Let's give it a primary key. And a few fields. Let's create it. And let's synchronize it to the database. Now let's switch to the repository view and let's add a services folder. In that services folder, we'll start by adding a CRUD interaction for our company. And let's add a block service as well to showcase the transactions. So what we want to do now is we want to create a company. Let's have the input here as well. Let's just map that. So now we have the company. Let's output the mapping here. So we can just create a company. And if we run it, we get to create it. But what actually happened at this point from a transaction perspective? When we ran the block service, this was the initial service, so the root service as we would call it. For example, a REST service that is being called from a third party or the front end. If we have a scheduled service or if we have an asynchronous service being run at a later time. All of those are examples of root services. If you don't do explicit transaction management, it will be automatically managed at the root service level. So we started the service. There's no transactions just yet. We added an interaction with the database. This is the first interaction, so it will actually start a new transaction and bind it to the root context. This is then run. The service, the root service ends. If it does not throw an exception, the service is considered successful and the transaction will be committed. Let's see what happens when we throw an exception at the end. So let's just add a throw and let's do this again. Let's add another company. But this one ends in error. If you now look at the company, you see that there's only one that's been inserted, the original one. Why? Because this root service just ended in an exception. The transaction is actually rolled back. Now this automatic approach to transactions works in 99% of all business use cases. If necessary, you can of course take more control over transactions. For example, let's add a sequence. In that sequence, we can set a transaction variable. Let's call it transaction ID. And let's move the map step to the sequence. As you can see, when we have this service, we actually have transaction ID here, which is optional. Let's map it here. Now let's do the same thing. So we add the other company, we run it, we still get an exception. Let's look at the company. Now it's been inserted. Why? Because now we've bound the transaction to the sequence, and the sequence will perform the same logic that the sequence itself end with an exception, then it's rolled back. Is the sequence successful? Then it will be committed. From this perspective, the exception is outside of the sequence, so the sequence itself will be successful. If we move this here, and let's try this again. So let's keep going. Yet another company. We still get the same exception. And if we go to company, you see that we still have two companies. If you need specifically scoped transactions, this is generally enough. You can go even further and you can, in a map step, you can do transaction start, commit, and roll back. If we were, for example, to do a start, let's do this one, you can see that we get a transaction ID here. This is more or less the same as we have with the sequence. So in this particular case, let's start a transaction. So let's start a transaction. Let's remove this transaction ID perhaps. Let's start a transaction here. We have the create. So now we need to manage the transaction manually. So what we could do here is we could have a catch, and the throw is before the catch. And in the catch, we can do a rollback of the transaction ID. Below the throw, we'll do a commit. So at this point, we would expect the throw to bring us to the catch, where we roll back. So if now we run this, we actually get a successful result because the throw was catched and supposedly it was inserted. But if we now actually look at the company, we see there's still only two companies because after this was created, the transaction was rolled back. So this gives you an overview of all the possible interactions with transactions. In my experience, the automatic transaction management is good enough for most business use cases. You generally need more control over transactions when you're building frameworks or stuff like that. So in general, you don't really have to worry about it. I hope it was interesting. See you next time.